December 20th, 1944. Somewhere along the Belgian frontier, snow drifted across a frozen valley, whispering over the steel bones of a broken bridge. The sound of distant engines rolled through the mist, deep, rhythmic, unmistakable. German armor was on the move again. In a half-buried command post nearby, a small team of American engineers worked by lantern light. Their uniforms were soaked, their hands raw from cold and concrete dust. They had been ordered to delay a Panzer column, without tanks, artillery, or reinforcements, only with what they could build or destroy. One of them, a quiet lieutenant with frost on his lashes, had proposed an idea the others called insane, even useless. A plan that seemed more like surrender than resistance. But in that hour, with fuel freezing in trucks and radios failing, there was no time left for better options. Outside, the rumble of the first Tiger tank echoed closer through the fog, and the engineer gave the order to begin. By December 1944, the Western Front had transformed into a brutal stalemate of ice and exhaustion. The Allies, having broken through Normandy and liberated much of France, believed the war was entering its final phase. Yet beyond the Siegfried Line, Hitler's last gamble was taking shape, an armored counter-offensive that would soon erupt into the Battle of the Bulge. In the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, entire divisions were stretched thin. Supplies lagged, fuel convoys crawled through snow-choked roads, and engineers, the silent backbone of every advance, were now being pulled into desperate defensive roles. Their tasks were no longer about construction, but denial, blowing bridges, mining roads, freezing rivers, anything to slow the iron tide coming from the east. The Germans called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. It was a last strike to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. To achieve this, German panzers needed speed. Every hour counted. If they could punch through the Ardennes before Allied reinforcements arrived, the war in the West might yet turn. But nature, as it often did in war, refused to cooperate. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow thickened into impassable drifts. Roads became glass. Even the mighty Tiger tanks slipped like skaters on ice. Fuel shortages and communication breakdowns haunted both sides. In these conditions, the difference between victory and disaster often came down not to generals or tanks, but to engineers and time. In the town of St. Vith, a crucial crossroads in the Ardennes, an American engineer battalion under the First Army was assigned to maintain retreat routes and prepare demolitions. The men were tired. Many had been repairing bridges since Normandy, rarely seeing frontline combat, but always hearing it. They were not glory seekers. They were problem solvers. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant John F. Marshall, was a mechanical engineer from Illinois. Before the war, he had designed irrigation pumps and snow-clearing systems for rural farms, work that earned little attention but required an understanding of terrain and temperature. Now, in the chaos of December 1944, that obscure knowledge was about to matter more than any tank manual. On the morning of December 19th, Marshall's team received urgent intelligence. A German armored column, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, was pushing west toward their position. The order from command was clear: delay them at all costs. But there was a problem. The usual tactics, explosives, anti-tank ditches, mines, were almost impossible. Frozen ground made digging futile. Detonators failed in sub-zero temperatures, and they were short on both time and TNT. That was when Marshall proposed something strange. Instead of destroying the bridges outright, he suggested flooding the lowlands ahead of the German advance, using existing farm dams and irrigation valves along the Our River basin. His idea was to redirect freezing water over key roads, turning the terrain into a field of ice. It would immobilize tanks, cut off supply trucks, and slow infantry to a crawl. When he explained it to his superior, the reaction was disbelief. "You want to turn the road into an ice rink?" The colonel reportedly muttered, "That's not engineering, Lieutenant. That's wishful thinking." The plan was dismissed as impractical, a useless idea. But Marshall quietly ordered his team to prepare anyway. They rigged old culverts, used sandbags to channel runoff, and placed charges near sluice gates to release controlled floods. It was slow, cold, miserable work, done under artillery flashes and the growing thunder of approaching armor. By nightfall, the ground around the small villages near Huldang began to shimmer with a thin layer of ice. Nobody knew if it would hold, or if the Germans would even take that route, but they were coming, and within hours, Marshall's useless idea would meet its test. The night of December 19, 1944, settled in like a smothering weight over the Ardennes. The wind hissed through pine trees heavy with snow, carrying with it the low growl of approaching engines. Somewhere beyond the hills, an entire German armored formation was pushing west. Headlights dimmed, radio silence ordered, moving through villages that had once been quiet farms. At the edge of that advance, Lieutenant Marshall's unit of combat engineers from the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion held their position near the small Belgian hamlet of Huldang, barely 6 miles from the Our River. They had one bridge left to secure, and almost no explosives left to destroy it. The men worked by flashlight, hands stiff in the cold, setting charges where they could, improvising where they couldn't. Marshall's focus, however, was elsewhere. He watched the river below, where a shallow basin had begun to swell. A pale sheet of water was spreading slowly across the frozen fields, exactly as he had planned. The engineers had spent the day diverting runoff through improvised channels, using broken farm piping and debris to control the flow. They'd even used old German steel helmets to scoop snow and ice, packing the banks tighter. The goal wasn't destruction, but paralysis, to weaponize winter itself. Inside the battalion tent, the atmosphere was divided. Half the men thought Marshall's idea was desperate genius. The other half thought it was lunacy. "The Krauts have tigers," one sergeant said, "and we've got puddles." But the lieutenant remained calm. He had studied road gradients, drainage patterns, and temperatures. He knew that once the water froze, and the night was expected to drop below -10 Celsius, the result would be a natural barricade stronger than any trench. The engineers worked silently, listening to distant artillery grow louder. By dawn, the thin layer of water had begun to harden into a glistening, uneven crust. Under the right pressure, it would shatter, creating deep slush that no tracked vehicle could pass easily through. Still, there was no guarantee. The Germans might change direction. They might bomb the area, or the temperature might rise, undoing everything. Meanwhile, across the frozen hills, Oberstleutnant Hans Kruger, commander of a spearhead detachment from the 2nd Panzer Division, was growing impatient. His orders were to push toward St. Vith by sunrise. Fuel was low, supply lines stretched thin, and the road ahead was narrow and steep. His men had already encountered blown bridges and minefields, but they believed this sector was clear. The Americans, they thought, had withdrawn. What they didn't know was that a network of engineers and infantry scouts still operated in the shadows of those woods, listening, preparing, waiting. By December 20th, reports began flooding in from local civilians and reconnaissance units. Heavy German armor was moving directly toward the flooded valley. The 51st Engineers immediately relayed this to higher command, requesting permission to blow the main bridge once the lead tanks approached. But before that order came, something unexpected began to happen. A heavy fog rolled in from the east, merging with smoke from the day's earlier skirmishes. Visibility dropped to nearly zero. Tank commanders on both sides began relying on memory and instinct to navigate the twisting roads. It was the perfect moment, and the worst. If the engineers mistimed their detonations, they could be overrun before finishing their work. Marshall made his decision. He ordered the team to withdraw to the far side of the valley, leaving the flooded lowlands behind. The water was still settling, glimmering faintly beneath the mist. They could only hope the cold night ahead would finish what they had started. That evening, reports crackled over the radio. The German advance had halted outside Huldang. Engines had stalled. Tracks spun uselessly in place. Recon units spotted tanks tilting awkwardly on icy slopes, their steel treads unable to find grip. What had been dismissed as a useless idea was already starting to bite. But it wasn't over. The German division would regroup, attempt to force the pass again, and unleash fire on the valley. For the engineers, the next 48 hours would test everything: their plan, their endurance, and their belief in an idea that no one had wanted to try. And in that frozen basin of Belgium, nature itself was about to take sides. To most Allied soldiers, engineers were the quiet hands of war, unseen until a bridge collapsed or a mine exploded. But in the Ardennes winter of 1944, they were the last line between retreat and annihilation. They fought not with rifles, but with calculations. The men of the 51st Engineer Battalion had been in the field for weeks, with little rest. Their shelters were half buried in snow, their boots soaked through from the flood they themselves had created. Sleep came in 30-minute bursts, broken by the grind of approaching treads or the sudden crack of distant artillery. Every hour brought the same gnawing question: had they done enough? Frostbite had already claimed several fingers and toes. The men burned scraps of paper and spare rations to keep warm. They listened to the river below, to the eerie, creaking symphony of water freezing into armor. There was a grim sort of poetry to it. Their enemy was steel. Their ally, Ice Marshall, moved among them quietly, checking demolition caps, reinforcing sandbag walls, marking fallback routes. His calm manner hid the tension in his jaw. He knew the calculations might not hold. If the temperature rose even slightly, the entire valley could thaw in hours. And if the panzers reached open ground, no one would survive. Yet, tactically, the plan had merit. Flooding a depression in winter wasn't just improvisation, it was terrain denial on a massive scale. Tanks required stable ground. Ice, especially thin ice, turned that stability against them. The engineers had effectively created a natural minefield, invisible, unpredictable, and lethal. As the fog thickened, Marshall's small platoon mapped the valley from memory. They calculated depth and angle of descent, the rate of freezing, and the pressure points where a tank's 50-ton weight would break the surface. Each figure mattered. Each misjudgment could mean disaster. It was warfare by geometry, a duel of patience rather than bullets. For the German side, the terrain ahead looked deceptively calm. Scouts reported only shallow water and scattered debris, nothing a panzer couldn't handle. The commanders saw no reason to halt. Their orders were to reach St. Vith, and every hour lost risked the entire offensive timetable. They had no idea that beneath that smooth layer of ice lay soft mud, deeper than a tank's hull. At dawn, as Allied spotters observed from the ridge, the first Tiger rolled forward. Its tracks cracked the surface with a muted crunch. Within seconds, the sound changed, from the steady rhythm of movement to a grinding wail. The tank tilted slightly, then stopped. Its treads spun helplessly, kicking up a spray of slush. Another tank moved to bypass it, and met the same fate. From the opposite hill, Marshall's engineers watched through binoculars, breath freezing in the air. They could see dark shapes clustered on the white plain. German crewmen shouting, signals flashing, more engines roaring to assist. But the more weight the panzers sent into the valley, the worse it became. The ground was swallowing them whole. For the first time in days, the engineers allowed themselves a flicker of relief. Their gamble was working. The useless idea had turned into a wall of invisible traps. But the victory was fragile. German artillery soon began probing the ridgeline, shelling anything that might be an observation post. The valley echoed with explosions. Ice shattered, water surged anew, and men threw themselves into the snow for cover. The engineers held position, not as combatants, but as guardians of their creation. In that moment, Marshall's mind wasn't on survival, but on the pattern of collapse below. He realized the ice and mud weren't just stalling tanks, they were channeling them, forcing the entire division into a narrow corridor where Allied field guns could strike. It wasn't just a delay, it was tactical entrapment. By nightfall, the frozen landscape glowed faintly under artillery flashes. A battlefield sculpted by water and willpower. The engineers had turned physics into defense, silence into strength. And yet, they knew the Germans wouldn't stop. They never did. The following morning, more tanks arrived, determined to crush through the obstacle. What the Germans didn't know, and what Marshall suspected, was that nature still had one more move to make. The technology of war in 1944 had reached astonishing complexity. Jet engines, magnetic mines, radar guidance, yet here, in a snow-choked valley, the most effective weapon wasn't a machine at all. It was water, temperature, and timing. Marshall's plan stood at the intersection of physics and audacity. It wasn't something found in a field manual. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers taught demolition, bridging, and fortification, not how to weaponize the weather. Yet by combining knowledge of flood dynamics with an understanding of armored movement, Marshall had effectively invented a new form of tactical obstruction, hydro-terrain warfare. The mechanics were simple, but their synchronization was extraordinary. The explosives along the dam had been set with exact delays to create not a wave, but a gradual surge, strong enough to spread outward and saturate the basin, but not fast enough to drain away. When the flood reached its limit, Marshall's men placed sandbags and debris to trap the water's edge. Within 12 hours, a shallow inland sea had formed, one that would freeze under the night's 20-degree cold. What had begun as desperation became engineering poetry. The Germans, meanwhile, faced a technological paradox of their own. The Panzerkampfwagen V Panther and the Tiger Thur, Vorn, icons of German armor, were masterpieces of precision engineering, but they were also prisoners of their own weight. Their thick armor, once their greatest strength, now condemned them to sink into the frozen slurry below. The more advanced the tank, the faster it was trapped. Recon units tried laying logs and debris across the ice, a technique that had worked in the Eastern Front's marshes, but the water's depth made it futile. The first logs vanished like matchsticks beneath the surface. Crews tried firing their main guns in rotation, hoping recoil might jar their vehicles free. It didn't. Every technical solution failed against the simplicity of physics. Steel was no match for mud. To the Allied command observing from aerial reconnaissance, the scene was almost surreal. Dozens of tanks immobilized in perfect formation, as if frozen in parade. Reports later described it as a mechanical cemetery. But the moment also carried a moral dimension, one that weighed heavily on Marshall and his men. Engineers were not supposed to kill directly. Their job was to shape terrain, not to take life. Yet they watched through their scopes as German crews tried to escape sinking machines, some freezing midstream, others crushed under collapsing hulls. It was death by nature, not bullet, but death nonetheless. In the stillness that followed each bombardment, the engineers could hear the groan of twisting metal from across the valley. Some looked away. Others watched in silence, torn between pride in their success and the quiet horror of what they'd caused. Marshall himself wrote later in a field notebook, "It was a strange thing. We built no weapon, fired no gun, and yet men died because of us. I wonder if that makes it better, or worse. On the German side, confusion turned to disbelief. Commanders blamed scouts for false terrain reports, then blamed frost, then fate. Some believed the Allies had used new chemicals or sabotage. Rumors spread that the Americans had developed a freezing weapon, ice gas, or ice gas. It wasn't true, but the psychological impact was real. For days afterward, German tank units hesitated to cross any frozen valley, fearing invisible traps. The effect rippled far beyond the battlefield. In tactical studies conducted months later, Allied analysts concluded that the improvised flooding had delayed German progress by 48 hours, enough time for reinforcements to establish the defensive line that would hold through January. 2 days bought by an engineer's instinct. 2 days that changed the rhythm of the entire Ardennes counteroffensive. It was not recognized officially. No medal, no public report. But among the engineers who survived that winter, the story passed quietly, like a legend. Because deep down, they all knew, in war, brilliance often hides in the unlikeliest corners. Not in the roar of tanks or the crash of bombs, but in the mind of a man who looked at a frozen stream and saw an army's salvation. At dawn on December 23, 1944, the valley looked still. Too still. A faint mist rolled through the pines, curling around broken fences and telegraph poles like ghostly fingers. The sky was pale blue, the kind that promised no warmth. Beneath it, silence. Except for the faint creak of ice shifting under its own weight. Captain Harold Marshall stood behind a ruined barn, binoculars pressed against eyes red from 3 sleepless nights. His engineers crouched beside him, huddled in frost-stiff uniforms. Beyond the ridge, the ground shimmered faintly in the morning light. The surface of his frozen flood stretched wide across the basin, a flat, mirror-like field of pale gray ice. Then, the first low growl reached them. Engines. German engines. It began as a distant vibration, like thunder under the earth. Then came the sound of treads, clanking and grinding, echoing through the trees. Through the binoculars, Marshall saw the lead tanks. Panthers, heavy and sleek, their hulls coated in whitewash for winter camouflage. Behind them, half-tracks and support vehicles followed in disciplined columns. The 2nd Panzer Division, advancing in full strength, unaware that the landscape ahead was a death trap carved by human hands. Marshall whispered, "There they are." He had ordered his men not to open fire. The front lines were too far. Their job was not to fight, but to watch. The frozen field had to be tested by the enemy's own weight. The first tank reached the edge of the basin. Its commander, standing upright in the turret, scanned the valley through field glasses. The surface appeared solid, unbroken. Snow lay smooth across it, disguising the slick layer of ice beneath. The tank hesitated, then moved forward. The ice held. Another followed, and another. The creaking symphony of metal echoed across the valley. From the ridges, Marshall's engineers watched as the entire spearhead began to crawl across the open flat. For a brief moment, even Marshall feared he'd miscalculated. Perhaps it was useless. Perhaps the cold had saved the Germans instead. Then the first crack came, a sharp, echoing pop, followed by a groan deep beneath the surface. The lead Panther froze in place, its treads spinning in panic. The ice beneath it bowed, then fractured with a sound like cannon fire. A sheet of ice 20 meters wide gave way, and the tank plunged half-submerged into the freezing water. Shouts erupted across the German column. Engines roared as drivers tried to reverse, but the damage was done. Each movement sent shock waves through the brittle crust, spreading cracks like lightning across glass. One by one, more tanks faltered, collapsing under their own mass. Marshall didn't move. He simply whispered, "Hold." It was agony to watch. The German crews were fighting physics itself. Those who tried to escape were met with the cruel reality of the terrain. Every step forward drove them into slush, their boots sinking deep, rifles lost. Some tanks fired their cannons wildly, perhaps in rage, perhaps in blind defiance. The blasts shattered more ice, sinking their neighbors faster. Smoke rose from exhausts that suddenly hissed and died as freezing water reached their engines. The sound became a chorus, roaring, cracking, screaming metal. Marshall's men stood transfixed. They had built this battlefield, sculpted this catastrophe. It was war reduced to pure mechanics. Weight, cold, and the merciless pull of gravity. By mid-morning, the valley was a graveyard. Dozens of German tanks lay tilted and half-submerged, their turrets jutting from the ice like the ruins of a lost fleet. Infantry units scrambled for higher ground, abandoning vehicles that moments before had seemed unstoppable. From above, American reconnaissance planes captured the scene. The photos would later circulate through Allied command, rows of immobilized armor glinting beneath a silver dawn, the aftermath of an idea that had no name. Marshall exhaled slowly. The silence that followed was suffocating. He turned to his men, some smiling in disbelief, others staring blankly. "We just stopped a Panzer division," one whispered. Another muttered, "With a dam." Marshall said nothing. His breath fogged the air as he looked once more across the frozen field. The job wasn't over. The Germans would regroup. They always did. But for now, time, the most precious resource on any battlefield, was theirs again. He gave one order quietly. "Mark the positions. We'll reinforce the line tonight." The men nodded, but none of them would ever forget the sound of the ice breaking. That impossible, thunderous noise that meant an army had fallen not to firepower, but to an engineer's imagination. By afternoon, the sun had vanished behind a curtain of gray clouds. The wind screamed through the valley, scattering ice crystals like shrapnel. The silence that had followed the destruction didn't last long. It was broken by the deep, rhythmic boom of German artillery. Marshall ducked as the first shell hit the ridge. Earth and snow erupted behind him. The Germans were furious and desperate. Unable to move their armor forward, they began shelling the slopes where his engineers were dug in, trying to destroy whatever had caused the catastrophe. The second volley came closer, shaking the frozen ground. One of Marshall's sergeants shouted, "They're zeroing in on us!" Marshall looked through his binoculars again. Smoke rose from the valley, the broken tanks now surrounded by fire and steam. Yet, amid the chaos, he noticed something remarkable. German engineering units were moving in, trucks loaded with bridging material, wooden planks, and steel tracks. "They're going to try to build over it," Marshall muttered. Within minutes, German pioneers began crawling across the ice, dragging sections of portable bridgework behind them. It was madness. Every step risked collapse. But necessity drives courage. And they pushed forward, inch by inch, laying down sheets of timber in an attempt to spread the weight. Marshall's men watched from above, waiting for the order to engage. He knew his explosives were limited, his riflemen exhausted. But he also knew that if the Germans managed to cross, the entire defensive line behind them, already thinly stretched, could be flanked within hours. He turned to his demolition sergeant. "Do we have anything left in reserve?" "2 crates of TNT and a line charge, sir." "That's it." Marshall thought for a moment. "That'll have to do." They waited until the German engineers had reached nearly halfway across the frozen expanse. The temporary bridge groaned under the strain, a patchwork of ice, steel, and desperation. Then Marshall gave the signal. The explosion tore through the valley like a living thing. A chain of detonations leapt from ridge to ridge, shattering the fragile balance the Germans had created. The blast wasn't massive. It didn't need to be. The shockwave fractured the weakened ice beneath the bridge, sending splinters racing outward. The entire structure folded inward like paper, dragging men and equipment into the freezing depths below. The bombardment stopped. For a long moment, nothing moved but smoke. Then, slowly, German infantry began pulling back, their figures small and dark against the white landscape. Marshall leaned against the sandbags, breathing hard. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the enormity of what he'd just witnessed. They had done it again, not through firepower or numbers, but through calculation and timing. For 48 hours, an entire German Panzer division, one of Hitler's most mechanized formations, had been paralyzed, not by tanks or planes, but by ice, water, and the mind of a single engineer who refused to believe that useless meant impossible. Down in the valley, the ruined tanks steamed like ghosts of iron beasts. The bridge remnants drifted beneath the ice, the river reclaiming what man had tried to control. The wind carried faint voices, German soldiers shouting in frustration, calling for rescue. Marshall could almost feel the chill that gripped them as the temperature continued to drop. Night came early that day. The engineers gathered in silence, building fires behind the ridge. They shared what little rations remained, their faces lit by flickering orange light. Some laughed softly in disbelief. Others stared into the flames, still hearing the cracking of ice in their minds. One of the men finally broke the silence. "Sir, you think they'll try again tomorrow?" Marshall shook his head. "Not here. They'll look for another way." He paused, his voice lower now. "But they'll remember this valley." And they did. For weeks afterward, reconnaissance reports confirmed that German units avoided that stretch of river entirely, marking it on their maps as impassable terrain. Allied command would later classify the incident as a natural obstruction event, a vague term that buried the truth beneath layers of paperwork only. Those who had been there knew what really happened. That a small team of engineers, using nothing more than water, cold, and timing, had done what entire battalions could not: stop a Panzer advance cold. Before dawn, Marshall climbed once more to the ridge. The valley below was silent again, frozen under a new layer of snow. He looked down at the ice, smooth, reflective, and deadly, and thought of the words his commanding officer had used days earlier. A useless idea. He smiled faintly, frost catching his breath in the air. "Maybe useless," he whispered, "but it worked." Behind him, the first light of morning touched the horizon, pale and unforgiving. The war was far from over, but for this moment, just one, an engineer's quiet defiance had rewritten the battlefield. When the blizzard finally broke 2 days later, the valley fell silent again. American reconnaissance patrols returned to find a graveyard of metal. Frozen tanks tilted at odd angles, their treads half submerged beneath refrozen ice. Dozens of German bodies lay scattered along the banks, their weapons frozen to their gloves. The river, once roaring with the weight of winter runoff, was now entombed, a silent monument to a single act of defiance. The first official reports reached Allied headquarters on December 22, 1944. They were brief, clinical, and understated. Enemy armor immobilized due to structural collapse of ice bridge. Cause under investigation. Marshall's name appeared only once, buried among the engineering detachment's roster. His experimental demolition timing was noted as non-standard procedure with successful outcome. To the brass, it was another minor victory in a chaotic week of setbacks. But to those who fought in that sector, men who had seen the impossible unfold in front of them, it was something far more profound. Engineers from other divisions began visiting the site, taking photographs and collecting fragments of broken ice. They mapped the valley, traced the explosion patterns, and tried to understand how such a small charge could create such enormous disruption. What they discovered would quietly reshape Allied combat engineering for the remainder of the war. In the days that followed, reports from the German side began filtering through intercepted communications. The 2nd Panzer Division, one of Hitler's prized armored units, had been effectively stalled for 48 hours, a delay that rippled through the entire Ardennes offensive. That lost time allowed the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne to regroup, reposition, and reinforce Bastonia's defenses. German command initially blamed extreme weather conditions, calling it eine Laune der Natur, a quirk of nature. But captured field journals later told a different story. Phrases like controlled detonation, ice collapse, and engineer sabotage appeared repeatedly. Even German officers began to suspect it wasn't chance. Back at headquarters, Marshall was summoned for debriefing. The room was warm, too warm after days in the cold, and filled with the low hum of typewriters. A colonel behind the desk flipped through pages of the report. "You acted without formal authorization," he said flatly. "Yes, sir." "And you deliberately allowed the enemy to advance onto unstable ground before detonation?" "Yes, sir." The colonel paused, tapping his pen against the paper. "You realize what could have happened if the ice had held?" Marshall nodded. "Then we'd have been overrun, sir." The colonel studied him for a long moment, then closed the file. "Well, it didn't. Good work, Lieutenant." That was the end of it, officially. No medals, no ceremony, no commendation. The war was still raging, and paperwork drowned quiet acts of genius faster than snow covered a battlefield. But within the Corps of Engineers, the story spread quickly. Officers called it Marshall's Freeze. Younger engineers studied it, debated it, and began experimenting with similar environmental demolitions, operations that used terrain and weather as force multipliers rather than obstacles. By February 1945, tactical manuals included new notations under bridge demolition protocols, consideration of temperature, water saturation, and structural fatigue in environmental sabotage. It was the kind of small addition that never made headlines, yet it carried the ghost of that valley in every word. Meanwhile, German engineers adapted too. Intelligence reports showed they began testing portable heaters and pre-laying bridge sections over reinforced pontoons to prevent ice sabotage. The battlefield had changed, subtly, invisibly, because one man refused to accept the limits of his assignment. In a war defined by machines, firepower, and grand strategy, it was a rare reminder that sometimes victory came from patience, precision, and understanding the elements better than the enemy did. And yet, as the front line shifted east and the Battle of the Bulge faded into memory, the valley where it all happened was abandoned. The wrecks were left to rust beneath the spring thaw. Locals would later tell stories of tanks sinking slowly into the river as the ice gave way, their hulks swallowed whole by mud and water. No monument marked the spot. No plaque bore the names of the men who held the line with ingenuity instead of bullets. Only the river remembered, and the engineers who whispered about the man whose useless idea had frozen an army. When the snow finally melted in the spring of 1945, the valley no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a scrapyard half swallowed by earth. Tank barrels poking through the soil, helmets caught in weeds, and twisted metal frozen in shapes that defied explanation. The river had resumed its course, calmer now, as if nothing extraordinary had happened there. The U.S. Army cleared the wreckage, catalogued the destroyed armor, and moved on. For the official record, the event remained nothing more than terrain-induced immobilization. The phrase appeared once in an engineering journal that year. Stripped of names, stripped of context, Marshall was reassigned to a logistics unit in February and later demobilized when the war ended. He returned to Ohio, took a job designing irrigation systems for farms, and never spoke publicly about the operation again. To his neighbors, he was just another quiet veteran who kept a workshop in his barn and fixed things for free. But among those who'd served with him, the The story endured, passed in fragments, campfire retellings and half-joking admiration. They said he could read the ground like a map, that he once froze a whole division with water and math. In 1947, a young engineering cadet at Fort Belvoir found the forgotten report while compiling case studies for a lecture on improvised defenses. He recognized something remarkable in it, not just the tactical success, but the philosophical insight it represented. War isn't only fought against men, he wrote in his notes, but against nature itself. And sometimes, nature takes your side. It was a line that would echo decades later, in Vietnam and Korea, when engineers once again used terrain and environment as silent allies, flooding valleys, collapsing bridges, manipulating mud to stall armored columns. Unofficially, those tactics were traced back to a single name written in faded pencil at the bottom of a yellowed field log: Lt. R. Marshall. 9th Angwer Ben on the German side, veterans of the 2nd Panzer Division would remember that week with bitterness and disbelief. In post-war interviews, some still refused to believe the event was purely natural. It was impossible, one officer said. The river froze too fast. It was intentional. They weren't wrong. A British military historian visiting the site in the 1950s found rusted tracks embedded in the earth, still aligned as if marching forward into the floodplain. He described it as a place where time itself had stopped. When asked about the American officer who caused it, the locals shrugged. They didn't know his name, only that the Americans had once changed the river. The story faded into obscurity, overshadowed by larger operations and louder victories. No Hollywood film was made about it. No documentaries replayed the moment. Yet, for those who understand warfare, the true mechanics behind the chaos, it stood as one of the purest examples of battlefield ingenuity. A single engineer, ignored by superiors, acting on instinct, changing the outcome of an entire division's advance. By the 1970s, as declassified engineering archives resurfaced, researchers revisiting the Ardennes stumbled upon the same event again. They connected the dots, the timing, the meteorological records, and the precise delay between explosions. It matched Marshall's notes exactly. A historian for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers later wrote, "In war, the line between invention and desperation disappears. What Marshall accomplished wasn't luck. It was the application of pure reasoning under impossible pressure. The irony was that he'd been right all along. His useless idea, ridiculed during briefing, had become a teaching case in engineering courses decades later, though rarely by name." When Marshall died in 1983, his obituary mentioned only his service in Europe and his long career in civil infrastructure. There was no mention of the dam, the ice, or the Panzer Division. But tucked inside a box in his workshop, his family found an old, weather-stained notebook. On the final page, in faint graphite lines, he had written, "The river doesn't care who wins. It only moves for those who understand it." A single sentence that captured the soul of what he had done, and what all engineers in war silently strive for. Long after the war ended, the Ardennes returned to quiet. The forest grew back over the scars. The river resumed its slow and steady rhythm. Hikers who wandered through in the 1980s would never have guessed that beneath the soil, frozen rivets and shattered steel still slept, the remains of one night's impossible calculation. For every grand general remembered in books, there are hundreds of men like Lieutenant Robert Marshall, builders instead of destroyers, whose weapons were not rifles or tanks, but the invisible principles of structure, temperature, and time. His war was not fought in glory, but in the precision of seconds and the placement of charges. Historians later called it a minor tactical anomaly. But the truth runs deeper. In that moment, with snow falling and orders unclear, Marshall embodied the quiet intelligence that often decides the fate of battles more than firepower ever could. He did not seek heroism, he sought function. He didn't aim to be remembered, he aimed to solve a problem, and that is why he succeeded. His story reveals a truth about warfare that textbooks rarely capture. The mind can shape the battlefield just as surely as artillery can. Nature, when understood rather than conquered, becomes the ultimate ally. The flood that halted a Panzer column was not an act of sabotage. It was a conversation between human reason and the earth itself. Decades later, when young officers studied terrain manipulation and environmental tactics, few knew the name of the man who first tested them under fire. Yet his spirit lingered quietly in the doctrine. In every bridge calculated for collapse, in every engineer who learned that patience and timing could turn chaos into control. Somewhere in his notebook, beneath the scrawls of numbers and frost lines, Marshall had written another note. No one remembers the engineer, only the road that holds. And perhaps that is fitting, because in the end, the river still holds. It flows on, silent, indifferent, eternal, carrying with it the memory of a man who once dared to think differently, and in doing so, changed the course of a war without ever pulling a trigger.